Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. During the next hour, we're going to try to present living history that looks at the great civilizations of the past to see how they have shaped our societies today. We explore the works of some of the great thinkers and leaders of time gone by that have influenced the modern world, and we reflect on some of the ideas that have impacted our outlook on life. To put this history program in perspective, I'd like to share with you the very first revelation to the Holy Prophet of Islam. Clearly, this is a history program, but I think because it's on the Voice of Islam, we need to appreciate the importance of history. And the very first revelation to the Holy Prophet of Islam is, in the name of Allah, the Gracious, the Merciful, recite in the name of thy Lord who created man from a clinging form, i.e. an embryo. Recite, thy Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man what he knew not. Nay, man does indeed transgress, because he thinks himself to be independent. Surely unto thy Lord is the return. This is chapter 96, verses 1 to 9, and it shows the importance that God has shown us in relation to man's biological development, i.e. the embryo that develops in the womb, which is similar to the development, I suppose, of life on earth over the many, many millions and perhaps billions of years. And also the importance of learning from the pen that God Almighty taught, history. We learnt our history about mankind, etc. With that introduction, I want to introduce our panel today who have joined me. We have our friend Amjad Hussain Sab from Leeds. Amjad's a scientist by background in chemistry, I think it was Amjad, and he is a prominent member of the Muslim Institute, which is a very powerful and far-thinking think tank or a learning group of leading Muslims across the UK, and I think they've got links internationally as well. Amjad's got major interest in history and many other subjects. So welcome, Amjad, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Iqbal.
We're also joined by Arif Ahmad, Saab. Welcome, Arif. I keep on saying Saab because this is largely going to be a program for our English friends in the UK. So we do slip into these things occasionally. But Arif, welcome. I know you are, by profession, you're an accountant, an important man to know in this day and age of where money matters a lot, but you also have a deep interest in history. And what I would like us to do is to at least give the listeners a flavor of the importance of history. And this program is largely going to be for the UK, although it's a DAB format and people all over the world will be listening, but hopefully people listening to the UK. And as we're in Britain and Europe, I want to set the scene and read you something I wrote several years back as a paper. The history textbook view of European beginnings runs something like this. Civilization began in Sumer and Egypt, but this was an inferior and oriental civilization. It was transmitted, inverted commas, via Crete to Europe, where it was turned into a higher civilization by the Western genius, and again inverted commas, of the Greeks and the Romans. The Dark Ages, inverted commas, we all know about the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages followed, and the Renaissance marked the return of Western genius. European ascendancy was regarded by many notable Europeans as a kind of natural dispensation which may never cease. Wise Europeans would go on discovering new lands and civilizing backward cultures throughout the world. This is something that I certainly got brought up with when I went to my schooling, and many of you have. And if I could turn to you, Amjad, in relation to this, I know in the 90s, Francis Fukuyama wrote a major paper, and I know we were discussing it earlier on. Do you want to make a comment on?
Well, maybe, yes, in passing, Francis Fukuyama obviously comes from a very right-wing think tank in the United States, the Brookings Institute, and so forth. What basically he's trying to emphasize is that we have reached a pinnacle, the Western civilization has reached a pinnacle, that we have perfected everything. We have perfected democracy, we have perfected laws, human rights, global government, and so on, the banking system, and we've gone to the moon and beyond, and so forth. So he thinks there is nothing more to discover, nothing more to perfect. So So he's actually fallen into a kind of a trap that the Islamic civilization did at the peak of our civilization, if you can say ours, as if we are somehow connected to it. But this is how it is, and it's actually going back to your earlier introduction. It's probably history is one of the one of the broadest subject that there is possibly under the sun. There is enormous scope and depth and breadth to it, and it's a subject that cannot be discussed or summarized in a single sitting or in a single broadcast. So, but nevertheless, we have to tackle this subject and talk about it and demystify it.
No, I'm hoping that between us we can cover quite a bit. Arif Sahib, clearly there was a little bit of arrogance in Fukuyama and a number of people who wrote in this manner. And in fact, only a couple of years afterwards, Samuel Huntington then wrote The Clash of Civilization, saying, well, oh crikey, maybe Western civilization is not the most dominant one or going to dominate, and there's going to be a clash perhaps with different civilizations, which in itself was worrying. But the reality is, Arif Sahib, is that world history is full of civilizations that have contributed in many, many ways, and there have been many civilizations in the past as well. And I know in your school days you took a lot of interest in history. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I think it is. First of all, thank you for inviting me on the programme. I think history is a very broad subject. I just wanted to pick up on something that Amjad Sahib was saying about history and about civilizations. Something more contemporary that maybe many of our viewers, maybe many of our listeners will have heard. There's a famous scientist around these days, Professor Brian Cox. I remember watching him on a TV programme. They're talking about science. And he said the reason why Britain and the West is so good at it, particularly Britain, is because we invented science. And I felt that was a very arrogant statement to make, but essentially writing off all of the contribution that many other civilizations have made, particularly the Islamic civilization has contributed to science. And it tends to be an attitude that people brought up in the West may have, that they don't know that there's a whole other world of history that predates what's going on these days, and contributions by the civilizations. So sometimes the emphasis is very narrow, and I think what we would like to try and do in this program is open up people's minds and tell them that there's a lot more to history. It's such a vast subject, and just because we studied history in school on a particular topic, be it the Vikings or be it Russian history, that doesn't limit the knowledge that we have. We should try and promote a greater understanding of history and see that it comes from many, many different sources. And I hope that's something that we can do and start doing today as well, I hope.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's such a shame, actually. Somebody like Professor Brian Cox doesn't recognize the contribution by many of civilization. But that's a challenge we have. And I hope in this program and throughout our interactions, we can show that, look, there's lots of different civilizations, different cultures that have contributed. Let's start off for this first program then, about retracing some of the major developments of where we are, how we've got here, how we came to being. And my understanding, and I'm not a historian by any means, is that clearly the Middle East has always been sort of thought of as the cradle of civilization, and the Chinese and Indus civilization will go into that. But probably the earliest civilization, the talk of is Sumeria. Amjad Sahib, do you want to sort of...
Yes, absolutely. The main thing to understand is that civilization is a lot older than we think, and the subject itself, as you said, has been unfortunately Eurocentric for a number of reasons, because the centers of learning have shifted. You see, Middle East was the center of learning and so forth, and the decline of that resulted in the shift of emphasis to Europe and then to North America. But obviously civilization is much older than Sumerians and the Egyptians and so on. And as we speak, the chronology has already been shifting into remote antiquity, to the Ice Age and beyond, actually, and partly due to new excavations that happen at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. That's pushed civilization well into 30,000 years, maybe earlier than that. So before even the melting of the Ice Age. And there are, of course, new what we call marine archaeology, a new subject within within history, you can say, is that new artifacts have come to light. There are civilizations under the sea.
Yeah. So I suppose what we want to do then...
Yes, sorry. But to emphasize, of course, history, as in recorded history, you need some sort of tangible proof, some sort of documentation, some sort of record. And of course, that can come in the form of pottery, shards, it can come, clay tablets and so forth. So the Library of Alexandria was also a written record. There are, of course, we get records from Herodotus, also known as the father of history, but from a point of view, he's also known as the father of lies. And that's within the, historical, professional circles. Historians, the European historians also refer to him as such as well. So there is, like I said, it's a very broad subject, and the advantage is that we're not professional historians, but we all have a passionate interest, to tackle this and to find out. I think there is a inherent instinct, within us that we need to know about the past. That there is something instinctive that for obvious reasons, you need to know who your grandfather was, where you come from, who we are as a species. Of course, there's a broader question, where we come from and how we connected. So, if you don't have a past, you don't have a history, you're lost, really.
I mean, in many ways, Arif, this is the verbal linkages that are passed on, which are common to many cultures, even currently bush cultures in Africa as well. We're going to go into sort of writing again, but that transmission is very important, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. I think the oral traditions, or whatever you would like to call it, are very important. I mean, sometimes even when you're children, your parents will tell you stories about your grandfather or your great-grandfather or somebody famous in your family. And children like to hear about this sort of thing. They like to know where they've come from, as Amjad Saab was saying. They like to know a little bit about that past. It's part of who they are. And I think there are certain cultures that seem to have very strong oral traditions, maybe that they have very good memories, retentive memories, and they keep this spirit alive where they share this information. And I think they are far better for that, far richer culture, where they have information about the past, about how they got there, about what their forefathers were doing. As you mentioned, writing is also very important, but also speaking about these things and remembering these things.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I'm sure you guys watch the TV as well, and Sir Richard Attenborough's program on the Reef. They were talking about the Aboriginal cultures passing on through their dances and just this oral tradition. And it just reminded me of 30,000 years back or whatever he was saying. They passed this thing orally, so just the importance.
And sometimes what happens is these develop into stories, and maybe some of the meaning is lost, but the general meaning in a story is still communicated. It might be about a great battle, it might be about the assassination of someone, and people might not quite understand why these stories are being told, but there's a historical incident or something that's happened which has caused this story or caused this tradition to come about, and these are still being talked about today. So it just shows that there's a strength of feeling about these incidents, and otherwise people would not be talking about them, they would not be carrying them on. And I think that is a very important thing, and everybody, no matter which culture they are from, will have experienced something like that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I want to go back to Amjad, because I know we were talking about some of the early civilization. When I think human beings became quite organized and into cities, and this is where Sumeria and some of the city-states began. But writing really made the big transformation, didn't it, in terms of what they were able to put down for their future generations and keeping records and moving on to the Egyptians. Take us through that, because I think it must have been one of the most fascinating developments for humankind.
It's one of the fascinating developments. Actually, one of the first cities on the planet was known as Eridu. It's an ancient Elamite city, and of course, remote antiquity. It meant the camp. That's where actually that word usage came from the Elamite into Sumeria, into Akkadian and Chaldean culture, and subsequently into Persian and Turkish, and now present-day Urdu. So we have the word Urdu, actually, the language that we use in India subcontinent. It's a amalgam of the languages, Indo-European as well as Semitic languages, but it meant obviously ability to convey the language of the camp, the language of the army, as it was, during the Mughal army, and that phrase was used. But originally the phrase was used to mean a camp or a city that was found in a remote antiquity on the confluence of the two rivers. Actually, now at present day still there. The archaeologists can take you there. It's called Eridu, and then of course all the other cities sprung up, on the banks of the river Euphrates and the Tigris in ancient Mesopotamia, the great cities of Babylon, or to mention a few, and so forth. And then you go up the Euphrates until Nineveh. You come to Nineveh is famous for a number of things, because it's also the city of the Yunus lesson.
Yes.
And there's a prophecy, because there was one Sahabi of the Prophet, one of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he visited Medina, and he said that he is from Mesopotamia, northern Mesopotamia. He says, you come from the city of my brother. The Prophet Muhammad was referring to Prophet Yunus.
Yes.
And the tomb of Prophet Yunus is there in Nineveh, and so was the Great Library, one of the earliest records of civilization.
Yeah, clearly, when you look at the holy books, in particular the Holy Quran and Bible as well, it's full of stories of the past, from Hazrat Ibrahim alayhi salam or Abraham's time, and Nimrod or Nimrud, and all the different things. But coming down to, I suppose, some of the great civilizations, I know quite often we talk about the Egyptians and their contributions, but similarly on the Indian subfront where we originate from, guys, the Indus Valley civilizations as well. Do you know?
I'm not much of an expert on this, but I do believe that the contribution of the Indian of the Indian subcontinent is often overlooked. There are many great things, language and mathematics and these sorts of things. Chess, I believe, also originated from India as well, and these are sort of things seen as things that are of a very high culture. I do think that these tend to be overlooked quite a lot, and I also think that maybe the people of those countries today, because some of them are very Western looking, they themselves don't really appreciate how rich their culture is. And I think they should look back and look at what the contribution, particularly of the subcontinent. I think that some of the very early civilizations, if I'm correct, are found in the India-Pakistan area, and there must be a reason for that. There must be reasons to why these civilizations existed, and they must have contributed to the civilizations that have come from that ever since then.
I think my understanding is part of it is around the river-based civilizations, because a lot of the early human developments were around the fertile crescents, and the river basins tend to provide that, in the Indus and with the Harappa and what's the other? Mohenjo-daro as well, some major developments as well. But I suppose that the most famous ones, though, have to be the Egyptians, don't you think? I mean, obviously, we're going to come to the Greeks, and we're going to come to the Greeks and Romans later on. But clearly, the Mesopotamian, the Syrians, the Babylonians, all the empires, Phoenicians, they all developed around there. But the one that's always in the limelight in terms of archaeology and development. And so, tell me how do you place the Egyptians and some of the? I mean, clearly in their writing as well, they've left many marks.
Well, of course, why Egyptian civilization is held in high regard is, of course, not just the temples, and the monuments they left behind, but also system of writing that has been deciphered due to, we found the Rosetta Stone, Al-Rashid. Al-Rashid is a town in the Nile Delta. That's where the stone tablet was recovered, which had Demotic Egyptian hieroglyphs and Greek written on it. So we can work backwards as to what the writing said. So that for thousands for millennia or two, the words, just those pictograms just came to life, as it were, and there was a great work done by the linguists in Paris towards the turn of the 19th century into demystifying Egyptian culture. But of course, I think one of the wonders of the ancient world, the pyramids, along with other wonders, has always fascinated mankind. And not just that, generally the word history mystifies. We're all we use this colloquial these idioms in our daily lives. For instance, to quote a few, to mean that you're no longer important or relevant, or you're dead. We say that another mistake like that and you're history mate.
Yes.
So and one once we're having a conversation and you think all has been said, you said, oh, well, we won't talk about that. That's history. That's the past, and so forth. And also, you mentioned about memories. Oral memories, also written records, and the Holy Quran says it's kitab. Kitab can be a written record, but also collective memory and thought of mankind. So what has mankind thought, our spiritual development, intellectual developments, and, all the things that we're fascinated with as a civilization, culture, as species. So it's a collective conscious thought. So it can be recorded, it can be oral. So Quran is written as well as oral. It's done through dual transmissions.
Sure.
So it preserves the collective memory and consciousness.
Yeah.
So, we use that in our records of, somebody's earned place in the history books. It could may well be the present, it's your deeds, your attitudes, your achievements, although, they're not recorded yet, but you've done such a epoch-making something, like, for instance, the discovery of Higgs boson has made history. Although we haven't quite made history yet, nothing's been written. I mean, the writing is ongoing.
Yeah.
But you see, we turn, we always put these things into our collective record. Be it. So history is not necessarily all about the past.
No.
It is about the present too.
Sure. And if you wanted to come in?
Yes, just to give you a simple person's perspective on the Egyptian history, I think one of the reasons why it's so interesting is that they're still making new discoveries. You very often hear about that they've discovered another tomb or maybe another pyramid or another valley, and you can go see these things today. So these are things which were created thousands of years ago. They're still standing. And every program you might watch about how the pyramids were made or constructed, it will amaze you. No matter which angle you look at it from, a historical angle, an engineer's angle, or whatever, where you look at it, you will wonder, how did these people thousands of years ago, who were considered, primitive by today's means, not having any of the equipment that we have today, how did they construct these pyramids? How are they still standing? Who organized that? And it just shows that, I think that's one of the reasons why it does stand out. The Egyptians do stand out. They have these things which are still around today, and you have to give credit to them for how they've actually created that. So there was definitely some order there. There was definitely some organization there. There was definitely some very clever people who organized and built these, and there was great, fantastic resources. Again, the same program that I saw about the workers who were working on these pyramids, for some of them it was their lifetime's work. They were handpicked at a very young age. They were told that they would be working on this. Obviously, no argument. That's what they were ordered to do. But yet their families were looked after. Their families were paid because they were working on the pyramids. And they might spend 30, 40 years maybe working on these pyramids. And I think that's one of the reasons why you just marvel at the wonder of how these Egyptians managed to do it, and how we are still finding out more and more about their culture today. And I think this sort of living history is fantastic. It's a great example for people to watch and a great example for people to follow, because it's still evolving.
No, absolutely, and it's given Hollywood a fantastic story.
So many films have come out of this as well.
The movies, etc.
Yes.
But another. Go on, Amjad.
Dr. Iqbal, I just wanted to mention that the Egyptian civilization, the Sumerians, the Indus Valley civilizations are actually not the original civilizations. The megalithic culture has been way overlooked by many things as primitive. Actually, it wasn't. And I do want to point for your listeners, for their interest, that there's a book by Christopher Knight and Alan Butler. It's called Civilization 1. The world is not as you thought it was.
Right.
This will really turn archaeology, history upside down, because most of these megalithic cultures, they use not just astronomy and megalithic building, but the zodiac as well as geometry, trigonometry, and so forth. So we're looking at remote antiquity. They had knowledge of astronomy, they had knowledge of the stars, they have knowledge of advanced mathematics. And that has been, Stonehenge. I know we live in the British Isles. It still mystifies people. And of course, one thing I do want to point out to your listeners is, you have to be really objective about this thing. And it's easy to, point to some sort of extraterrestrial source, as is, as the
Well, there are some authors who clearly,
One theory.
If you really want to investigate something, bear in mind that mankind have been here longer than we all of us think. And history, for instance, as being taught at university, is being pushed back all the time. The calendar is being pushed back as to what civilization is. As we speak, and thank God, in the 21st century, we have developed advanced tools of radiocarbon dating and so forth, and these give us some sort of real good tangible handle as to the antiquity of the artifacts and antiquity of the sites and so forth, and so modern archaeology has really pushed back the calendar to remote antiquity as to what we regard as civilization. And not just that, we inherited from the megalithic culture, the megalithic yard.
Yes.
And which the Egyptians used and so on, which the Sumerians have used. So we inherited this from our forefathers. So basically, the story of mankind, how we evolved as species out of Africa, and then basically inhabited all the known continents and land masses. So civilization we can trace it back using modern techniques, that we were highly evolved, a species, and exceptionally intelligent. And I think, just in passing, I just want to maybe this will demystify some of the arrogance that we all have. And of course, the dominant civilization, the European civilization, is a lot more arrogant than all of us put together. But then again, they say these things come with the territory, as it were. But intelligence is not just unique to mankind. Actually, there are species out there which we don't regard intelligent at the moment, are just as intelligent, whether they be at the microscopic life forms, or primates, or dolphins for that matter. They're exceptionally intelligent. So what we can maybe say is that dolphins are intelligent, but they don't have libraries. The primates are intelligent, but they have no record keeping, so forth. But this is what sets mankind apart, is that we keep records, we keep libraries. So in a way, we are extelligent.
Yes.
We can refer to the books as our intelligence is stored in the Library of Nineveh, or the Library of Alexandria, or the Great British Library, and so forth and so forth. So all great cultures have libraries. And it's, again, like I said, it's a collective memory of mankind. So civilization, there's no such thing as a European history or Asian history, although we like to compartmentalize these things. History is common heritage of all mankind. It's the story of mankind, how we evolved, and cultures have always intermingled, migration has always happened. And the British is a unique example, actually. There's no such thing as Britishness. We are all amalgam of different cultures and so forth. There's no and the human species has always been in transition. We migrate for different reasons, for economic reasons, or if there are cataclysms, climatic changes, and so forth, and for war. If there are wars and conflict, people are migrating from Syria as we speak, and so forth. So we need security, we need peace to flourish, and wherever we find mankind found, we need to shelter from the elements and so forth.
I want to touch on a number of other things, Amjad Sahab. I mean, clearly these civilizations have left their marks, and through the various excavations we're finding them, how great their architecture was, etc. Let's have a break at this stage, and then we'll pick up from there again. So welcome back. So we've talked quite a bit about some of the major civilizations and their contributions, and clearly they've left their marks as more and more archaeological discoveries are showing some of their architecture, etc. But one of the things or a couple of the things that will have really helped them is, one, transportation means of moving around within their empire and expanding their empire, and two, I suppose, the art of warfare. What do you think, Arif? I mean, clearly, without the right weapons, you can't expand. What role do you think they'll have played?
Of course not. I mean, in today's, in relevant, recent history, there are arms races, and there are arms races going on all the time, and it's a fact of life that all of the great civilizations would have had great armies, would have been developing great weapons, and if you had better weapons than your neighbors, or you had better weapons than another culture, you were able to almost overcome them or subsume them and take them over. So I think, although people don't like to focus on the fighting, that is part of history. The battles throughout history, where one culture is fighting with another culture, or one empire is expanding. And that has happened all the time, and it's still happening, unfortunately, in today's
Well, you see
society.
current examples, don't you?
All over the world. You don't have to go very far to see that. I think also something else that should be added as well, and this is something which is also still relevant today. If you had some intelligence, you could use tactics to maybe overcome your opponents. One of the very first things I studied in history was the Battle of Hastings. And I still remember to this day that William the Conqueror was at the bottom of the hill and King Harold was at the top of the hill. And William used his tactics to sort of engineer a false retreat. And King Harold's men followed him down the hill, and then they were surrounded and they were defeated. So although having good weapons is obviously very important, you need to have some brains that goes with it as well. And I think, again, the great civilizations, they would have had great thinkers, philosophers, politicians, people who know how to organize people. And of course, they had the great military people, the great fighters, the great warriors, or whatever you want to call them, who implemented the orders and designed the weapons and knew how to exert their influence.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the saddest chapters, Amjad, I find is the poor Aztecs. You know, when the Spanish Conquistica period happened and they went over with their shining swords, and these poor chaps, you know, they had some fantastic structures like the pyramids and whatever, but they had wooden swords.
Oh, absolutely, yes. You mentioned, well, the metallurgy.
Yeah.
I mean, Arif mentioned the tactics and so on, but of course we're dealing here as the cultures move from Clovis Point, you know, the sharp, the tips of the stones or obsidian, as it was, you know, making the arrow points into Bronze Age. And then obviously bronze was still soft relatively, could be paste. And then we moved into Iron Age. So metallurgy, and of course the temperatures of the kiln, you know, if you had good blacksmiths and good artisans on your side. And again, even these catapults played major parts and so forth. And then we move into the gunpowder empire that made the great city walls obsolete. And this is how Sultan Mehmed the Fateh, the you know, conquered Constantinople, you know, the Mamluks and the Turks and so forth, and they grow. And actually the other than, of course, the Persian will come back to Darius the Great. But of course, in recent, well, relatively recent history, we got the Mongols, and what they have, the archers and the horse. Mobile, basically, cavalry.
Yes.
Wreaked havoc through everywhere.
Oh, absolutely.
They brought great empires and civilizations to their knees just at the back of a horse and archery. Just mobile, and you know, they'll come and retreat, and you know, it was you know,
the bow and arrow was the classic weapon, wasn't it?
And the composite bow actually was the composite bow, which was a lot smaller than the archers, the contemporaries used. You know, using sinew from the horse. So they lived basically off the horse, the mare's milk, and if the horse died, you ate its meat, and the mare provided you the milk and so forth. And of course, you could use the skin from the horse to make the tent and the clothing, and his bones and his ligaments to make the composite bow. And of course, they had great artisans, and there was and they learned actually they learned these tactics have been used by the Persians, and this is how actually the one of the pharaohs, I've forgotten the name now, he defeated the Hittites, because it was basically the two-wheeled chariot of the Egyptians.
Absolutely,
was far more superior than those of the Hittites, and that's.
In fact, that reminds me, the wheel clearly it played a big part, didn't it, in some of the warfare and the achievements and transportation as well. How far back are we looking at? Who's good with their?
Well, the wheels are still. Of course, people like to put these dares on it and things.
No, roughly, how far back was it?
Well, the stone wheels been discovered. That could have been part of the carts and so forth, and they date back to around 9,000. Some people. But the thing with the stones is very difficult to date, and they use other means of strata. Bits of shards of pottery or some organic living, parchments or leather or something like that, or bones, and they think it's around 9,000. Some people think where other wheels have been found, these stone wheels, and they can date them back to around 10,000.
Probably the Middle Eastern empires.
Again, the hunter-gatherers, and obviously when the great cities were built, you needed to transport things and so forth. So the wheel, as first the stone wheels, then obviously the wooden wheels, and so forth, and But it is. Some people like to be affirmative, put a date on it, as in the history books. But as with these things, it's very difficult to pin it down, in time and space. But we can say it has a remote antiquity for sure.
We've obviously not touched on the Chinese civilization, and they clearly played some major parts, and we'll cover them in some other programs. We've touched on the Indus, the Middle East, the Egyptians as well. Let's turn a little bit to the European civilizations, because clearly that's played a major part. And I want to read this really interesting a bit of mythology. Let's put it mythology. Some put it in history books as well, but how Western civilization originated. And it says, Western civilization was born on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. In a lovely myth, the Greeks described how a Phoenician princess, Europa, was abducted by Zeus. Zeus was the Zeus, yeah, the great god, the king of the gods. Distinguishing himself as a tame bull, he surprised her while she was playing on the beach and carried her off to Crete, the small island off the coast, yeah. The truth behind this legend was well known to every Greek in Homer's time. It meant that the roots of his culture were to be found in the Middle East. According to other legends, the earliest Greek heroes, kings of Argos and Thebes, were of Egyptian and Phoenician origin. So you can see the linkage. We've been talking about the Middle East, how that civilization got brought over to the Greeks and the Romans through Crete as well, and the Minoan civilization as well, Amjad.
Again, great maritime powers. And let's not forget that, North Africa played a great part, not just Egypt, but also Libya and Hannibal the Great, in defeating Rome and so forth. So it's what was actually fascinating about Carthage is that they were the great maritime power, and Mediterranean was at one time North African lake, so more of a Carthaginian lake really, until a ship ran aground on one of the Greek ports, and they deciphered, they tried to, and that was a unique warship.
Yeah,
it was like a frigate that was maneuverable, and it was built using what we call today segmented techniques.
Mm-hmm.
Each part was labelled, and they disassembled it in a way, and reverse engineered the ship, and that brought on the wars as well. But of course, all cultures do not exist in isolation. Greek themselves are obviously built upon.
Because I want to come to the Greeks and the great Persians in a minute. But Arif wants to come in. Go on, Arif.
Yes, just one small point. I think that it's important to bear in mind, and again, if you use recent history, that whenever a civilization is developing, it does adopt the best that it finds. Why reinvent the wheel, to use a phrase, when you can steal things from other cultures? Yeah. And whenever there's, for example, a great conflict or an empire being built, we see this even today. 1 million people have just immigrated to Germany. That's going to cause a massive change in the culture of Germany. It's going to bring people from outside. And I think we've seen this throughout history, where it's easy to compartmentalize and say this is Western culture, this is African culture, or this is Middle Eastern culture. They all have an role to play with each other. They all mix into each other. Even sometimes some of the military rulers would encourage it. They would say, well, if we want these people to be friendly with them, we need to mix with them, and they would encourage intermarrying. So I think that this needs to be remembered, that it's not all about just compartmentalizing and say, well, this is where one culture stops, or when another culture starts, or one period of history stops, another period of history starts. There's a natural flow. There are things that have been picked up from all over the place, and that's continuing today. And so we might be taught that they're all very different, but I think there's a lot of linkage between all of them.
No, you're absolutely right. And just to expand on that point, I mentioned really the origins of Western culture and Greek Roman culture, which clearly, we relate to so much in Europe when we look back at history. And funny thing is, when you look at the Greek Roman cultures, when they look at Egypt and some of those cultures, it's in a relatively friendly manner. Yeah, when they look at the Persian culture, and the animosity starts coming out. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because the Greeks clearly were a great power, but they had always massive battles going on with the Persians.
Well,
Amjad,
actually, one of the first great empires on the planet was the Persian Empire by Darius the Great. The empire stretched from the shores of Atlantic to the riverbanks of Ganges, and to the north, the Caucasus.
This is Cyrus the Grand that we
yes,
know. Yeah.
And Cyrus the Great is prophesied in the Bible. Is the vision by Prophet Daniel. Yes.
Yeah.
Prophet Daniel has a vision that a great ram will come from the east, and he will free the Jews from the bondage from Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes.
Remember, Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. He sacked.
Well, I'm going to touch on the religious aspect.
Yes,
but go on.
Sacked the first temple and brought the Jews in bondage to Babylon. And again, Babylon has a very important, it's an ancient historical city. Bab al, we use the word al, God. So gate of the gods, gate of the god.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a very remote antiquity. Again, we're dealing with, built on by successive cultures. And the Persians built on that. And it was actually Darius the Great who went and brought the great, the fire temple and the great ziggurat. That ziggurat still is actually, we look at the classical arts and classics, it's a round Tower of Babel. Actually, that pyramid is actually rectangular. And a step pyramid, just like the Aztec and the Mayan pyramids. The edifice is like that. It's not like the Egyptian pyramid as the classical pyramid and triangular base. It's a step pyramid that is rectangular. It actually is fascinating. As a heap of mound is still there in Iraq, and if you those who are obviously it's a place of upheaval, but hope when things calm down, tourists start going there again, and it's. That's what was brought down by Darius the Great, and then he conquered Babylon and freed the
It's interesting,
Jews.
Amjad,
and he's mentioned in the Quran as the two-horned one. Dhul-Qarnayn.
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, he's been by historiographers, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, he's been confused with Alexander the Great. But Alexander the Great,
it wasn't him.
It wasn't him, and that's again. You see, history is again like this. What I like to mention is that. We all know, historians do not, and there is a common misconception that we reconstruct the past. What historians actually do is they produce knowledge about the past. As with all of us, we are product of our own unique cultures, upbringing, schooling, and so forth. And as is the case with respect to each individual, the fallible historians too produce contribution towards the past, and of course tainted by their worldview. Arif wants to say something.
Sorry, it's just a small point about historians, just picking up on what Amjad has said. Some of the big rulers or some of the great emperors would have their own historians. Now bear in mind that they were paid by the great emperor, and the emperor wanted to be portrayed in the best possible light. So it would be nice to think that the historian is going to present a very balanced view or going to present all the facts. They will present things which will obviously put a positive shine on what was happening at the time. They might even apologise for great atrocities that were happening. Because ultimately, if their boss is a big emperor, they want to portray him in the best possible light. And this continues to this day. This might mean anything to people like me, but I think there's a famous pop star called P. Diddy. Many of our, maybe a younger you might know who he actually is.
I'm afraid that's past me.
And I've read that he has his own historian who follows him around to the day. And of course, he wants to make sure that his legacy will be portrayed in the best possible light. So all of the negative things, all of the funny things that he might get up to, I'm sure the historian will gloss over that and will only write down or mention or play up the good things that person has done. So, we have to take some of what the history has said with a pinch of salt, and we have to try and corroborate it. We have to look at what other historians were saying. We have to look at the actual events. Do they support the facts? Because history is like everything else. It can be twisted, it can be manipulated from a particular point of view.
Well, I mean, just taking a point, Hollywood's great at that. This film about the 300, I mean, it's Hollywood taking the battle between the Greeks and the Persians and interpreting it in their way, and
this is the Battle of Thermopylae, as it is known. 300 Spartans stopped 100,000 Egyptians. It's just nothing.
No,
but,
the Persians.
The Persians. Sorry, I beg your pardon.
Yeah,
the Persians.
Yeah.
It's just nothing but fairy tale. And it's. I know the Iranian government has lodged a very strong protest, and even the president, because it is not just insult to the Persians. It's insult to facts. Everybody knows there were more than 300 Spartans there. Probably in the number in thousands. And so I think it was a fair fight, but because of the topography and the geography, the Persians lost. It was not, of course, the Spartans had the home advantage. Let's not forget that. Of course, what it is a turning point for the European history. As one of the otherwise they would have been overrun by the Persians. Today we'll be all Iranians.
I think the phrase they use is inspired by real events, which means that they can basically manipulate it to whatever they want to say. There was an event that took place, but this is our take on that story.
Yeah, I'm interested in a little bit more of the contribution the great Persian Empire, Cyrus, made, and maybe that this is the right point then to start looking at some of our ideas about our theology, about our philosophy, and our ideas developing then from the Middle East across Persia, Egypt, or whatever. Do you want to start off? Because
I mean, just to mention this, we if you come from the subcontinent, that is, to some of our listeners, we have a hero that is personified in the late Dr. Sir Mohammed Iqbal, and actually his doctorate was on the development of metaphysics in ancient Persia.
Oh, right.
So where does Rohaniyat, metaphysics, spirituality come from? And he investigates this in his PhD thesis. And he points to the way that the great Magi culture, which we call the Majus, and because obviously there is a negative spin, we think they were fire worshippers and pagans and so forth. But of course, they believed in
Zoroastrians.
Zoroastrians, yes. The Zoroastrians were not pagan. No. They believed, in God, Hure Mazda. They believed in divinity, and they believed in one God. And of course, they believed in the good and evil and so forth, and they're great prophets. And of course, in the Holy Quran, if we were to take it objectively and subjectively both, it treats Darush or Darius the First or Cyrus the Great in a great, holds him in high esteem, elevates him to the status of a righteous person, just below the prophet. So the Persians too had a prophet, and Mazdak is well known. I think people trace, certainly if you belong to if you're a left-wing politician or left-wing thinking, some of the great Western and most of the the left-wing politicians trace back, socialism down to Mazdak, an ancient Persian philosopher and a mystic who spoke of well-being of collectively as mankind, aloof of race, color, creed, and where you come from. And of course, that was a spiritual development, and of course, is mentioned in the Bible, the Torah, and the Gospels, Darush, and the Holy Quran. So he was a person of significance, and spiritually as well as with military prowess. But above all, the Persian Empire did bring the landmass and various cultures together by their network of roads, communication, and the mail system was introduced by Darush the Great, and he collected the fauna and the flora from different parts of the empire. So if you look at, people are fascinated by Taj Mahal today and his Mughal gardens. The Mughal gardens and the Persian gardens are actually based on the original garden of Darush the Great, and it had a central lake, and it's based on even remote antiquity. What we have, the paradise and the utopian culture of Jannat Nazir. So basically, Taj Mahal is a carbon copy of the dreams, and it's actually. It's it's nothing to do with the love of Emperor Shah Jahan for Mumtaz.
Don't break people's hearts.
There is a great. If you look, people, if you read the Tasawwuf and metaphysics, there is actually in Ibn al-Arabi is one of the books I have on my shelf, and there is a diagram of Arsh Mu'alla. A pictogram of a vision basically, and as being a great Sufi, he envisaged this in his vision, that how the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will look as in his majesty. And actually Shah Jahan made that edifice as the Arshe Mualla, the throne of heaven, as a throne of Allah as it is in heaven.
Right.
And the gardens are based on the original Persian gardens, which is the central lake of Jannat-e-Nazir and 4 rivers flowing from it. So based on a kind of a cross, central lake.
How history
repeats itself,
yeah.
and this goes back to Darush the Great. So Darush the Great was not just a general and emperor. He had the metaphysical thing to it, sciences, and the first garden he collected, like I said, to mimic the original garden, the lost paradise. And the paradise, don't forget, is a Persian word, paradise. So there is, it's found into the vocabulary of all cultures now.
I want to bring it to our sort of spiritual development and religious theology, etc., as it's developed. If we look at the world now, and you look at the Abrahamic traditions, you've got over 1.5 billion Muslims, probably about approaching close to 2 billion Christians, a small number of Jews, but if you look at that, and then obviously we've got Chinese civilization in it, so a massive representation, especially in the parts of the world we've been discussing, where you had the Semitic, I suppose, traditions and faiths. And yet, in those early times, they were a tiny, tiny, tiny minority in these massive civilizations. We would like to say it was God's hand, clearly, that, protected them, safeguarded them. But let's go back to, as Genesis says, in the beginning, in the origins, how our ideas shaped up about one God becoming such a dominant feature. And I mentioned the Greeks with Zeus and a number of other gods. So I want you to take me through, just maybe yourself initially, there were many, many gods for all these. The Assyrians, the Babylonians and whatever, the Egyptians had so many, and how it all shaped up.
There were, if you look at the gods, again, we mentioned in passing the Babylon. Babylon, the gate of God. Bab is still an Arabic Semitic term, the gate of the God. And actually, the God has always been one. It's just that different cultures have given different names to gods. So there are gods by the tongues, as it were. And you mentioned Prophet Abraham. Let's not forget, Prophet Abraham is from the city of Ur, from the tribe of the Chaldees, according to the Genesis story, the Chaldees being the present-day Kurds. So in a way we are all Kurdish. Because the great patriarch was Kurdish. And he lived in the city of Ur. And his father was a royal priest. And he marries his own cousin, Sarah, obviously migrates to Canaan, and then settles in what we call Hebron today, and is buried there. But remember, there is an Egyptian connection to it because his wife Hagar is Egyptian, and she's wrongly taken to be an Egyptian slave. Actually, she wasn't. Now, the history and the facts prove that she was actually an Egyptian princess. So he marries a Babylonian wife and an Egyptian wife. So the two high cultures coalesce in the great patriarch, and he carries all the wisdom and the ancient wisdom traditions. But because it just so happens with the conflict Moses has with the Pharaoh of his time, we tend to ridicule all Egyptian civilization and rubbish it as as deviant. Let's not forget the Prophet Joseph became a minister in the Pharaoh's court. So if the whole thing was batil, to say, deviant, then why would a Hebrew prophet become a minister in the affairs of that government? So it speaks volumes.
This is a fascinating story, isn't it? Because I want us to, in the next program, maybe start building up really the relationship between some of these great ancient civilizations and how the Semitic tradition, Abrahamic tradition really built up. And
there you have the Abrahamic connection, and not just that. Actually, there is a great Indian sage, Maulana Abdul Hayy Viryadati, and when he researched about Prophet Mohammed in ancient scriptures, he came across that Brahmaji in the Hindu tradition and Hindu mythology may well be personification of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and Brahmaji has two wives. one of the bitter Saraswati, and the other one, sorry, I've forgotten the name. So one could be taken to be Sera, the other to be regarded as Hagar, and he has two sons, one of the sweet water, one of the bitter water, and so there's fascinating. So mythology is connected, of course, through marriage, of the great patriarch, through Hajar alayhi salam being Egyptian and Sarah alayhi salam being Babylonian.
Well, it's a fascinating discussion. I think we've covered some of the great civilizations, and I think we can end at a good point and carry on maybe in the next program. So I hope our listeners have found this informative. I've certainly enjoyed talking to you both. So Arif Ahmad Saab and Amjad Hussain Saab, thank you very much. It's goodbye from me.